So, Donald Trump just watched federal marshals begin the process of seizing his properties, and the judge overseeing this case didn't just reject his legal arguments, she systematically demolished them in a ruling so scathing that legal experts are calling it one of the most brutal judicial opinions they've ever seen against a former president. And what triggered this financial catastrophe? Trump's own lawyers filed emergency motions claiming the asset seizures were unconstitutional, that the fraud judgment was politically motivated, and that forcing him to pay would cause irreparable harm to his business empire. The judge's response? She called his claims frivolous, legally baseless, and an insult to the integrity of the court. This isn't just about one real estate mogul losing some properties. We're talking about the systematic dismantling of the Trump Organization's crown jewels, buildings that have defined the Manhattan skyline and Trump's identity for decades, now being cataloged, appraised, and prepared for seizure to satisfy a massive civil fraud judgment. And trust me, when federal authorities start putting padlocks on Trump Tower and you've got moving trucks outside 40 Wall Street, the reality of legal accountability becomes impossible to ignore. It's honestly hard to believe we're watching the Trump empire, built over 50 years and brandished as proof of his business genius, potentially crumble because he couldn't stop lying about how much everything was worth. Let me fill you in on what's been happening. This all goes back to New York Attorney General Letitia James's massive civil fraud case against Trump, his adult sons, and the Trump Organization. For years, James investigated allegations that Trump systematically inflated the values of his properties when seeking loans and insurance, but deflated those same values when it came time to pay taxes. We're not talking about minor discrepancies here. According to the investigation, Trump claimed his penthouse apartment was nearly 3 times its actual size, valued Mar-a-Lago at over $500 million when it was worth a fraction of that, and played fast and loose with property appraisals across his entire portfolio. The case went to trial in late 2023, and Judge Engoron found that Trump had engaged in persistent and repeated fraud spanning decades. In February 2024, the judge issued a judgment of over $450 million, including interest, and ordered the disgorgement of profits obtained through fraudulent means. Trump immediately appealed, but here's where the rubber meets the road. Under New York law, to pause enforcement of a judgment while you appeal, you need to post a bond covering the full amount plus interest. That means Trump needed to come up with roughly $500 million in cash or secured assets to halt the seizure process. According to Politico's reporting from March 2024, Trump's lawyers claimed they approached over 30 surety companies and couldn't find anyone willing to underwrite a bond that large using Trump's real estate as collateral. Why? Because Trump's own fraud case proved his property valuations couldn't be trusted, and no serious financial institution was willing to take that risk. And before we go any further, let's be real for a second. Asset seizures don't happen to former presidents. They don't happen to billionaires who actually have the money they claim to have. They happen when someone has exhausted every legal option, when courts have determined they owe massive sums, and when they either can't or won't pay. The fact that we've reached this point tells you everything about Trump's actual financial situation versus the image he spent decades cultivating. Here's where it gets interesting. According to multiple sources, including CBS News and CNN legal reporters, the asset seizure process began in earnest this week when New York State attorneys, accompanied by federal marshals and court-appointed receivers, started showing up at Trump properties with court orders. At 40 Wall Street, a historic Manhattan skyscraper that Trump has long touted as one of his prized possessions, officials were seen entering the building with documentation to inventory assets and establish control procedures. At Seven Springs, Trump's sprawling Westchester estate, appraisers hired by the court were granted access to conduct formal valuations. Even Trump Tower, the gaudy golden skyscraper on Fifth Avenue that's been synonymous with Trump's brand since the 1,980 seconds, saw legal officials entering to begin the process of determining how the property could be liquidated or transferred to satisfy the judgment. Trump's legal team tried everything to stop this. They filed emergency motions arguing that seizing properties would cause irreparable harm, not just to Trump, but to the tenants, businesses, and employees who occupy these buildings. They claimed the whole process was politically motivated, that Letitia James ran for office promising to get Trump and was now following through on that political vendetta. They even argued that enforcing the judgment before the appeals process was complete violated Trump's due process rights. According to NBC News reporting, Trump's lawyers painted a picture of chaos, suggesting that forced asset sales would crater property values, hurt innocent parties, and amount to an unconstitutional taking. The judge wasn't having any of it. In a written ruling issued this week that legal analysts are describing as absolutely devastating, Judge Engoron addressed each of Trump's arguments and systematically destroyed them. According to CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin, who reviewed the full opinion, the judge's language was unusually blunt for a judicial ruling. She noted that Trump had been found liable for fraud after a lengthy trial with ample opportunity to present his defense. She pointed out that the judgment wasn't some surprise, but rather the predictable consequence of conduct the court had already found to be persistent, egregious, and calculating. The judge specifically called out Trump's claims of irreparable harm, noting that the harm was entirely self-inflicted. If Trump didn't want his assets seized, he could have either not committed fraud in the first place or posted the required bond to stay enforcement. His inability to secure a bond wasn't the court's problem, but the ruling got even more pointed. The judge addressed the political motivation argument head-on. She wrote that Trump's suggestion that the entire New York justice system, from the Attorney General to the courts, was engaged in some coordinated political persecution was not only unsupported by evidence but insulting to the integrity of the judicial process. She noted that Trump had received every procedural protection, that the evidence of fraud was overwhelming, and that pretending this was political rather than legal was exactly the kind of bad faith argument the court had come to expect from Trump's legal team. According to MSNBC's legal correspondent, the judge essentially accused Trump of trying to weaponize the appeals process, using procedural motions not to seek justice but to delay accountability indefinitely. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen Trump try to delay, deny, and deflect when facing serious legal consequences. This pattern of fighting every step, claiming persecution, and refusing to accept court authority has repeated throughout his legal troubles. Just think about how Trump handled the classified documents case. For months, he claimed the documents were his, that he'd declassified everything with his mind, that the National Archives had no right to them. He fought the subpoena, ignored the court orders, and forced the FBI to execute a search warrant. Even after being indicted, he claimed it was all a political witch hunt, that former presidents could keep whatever documents they wanted. It took criminal charges and the possibility of prison time before the arguments shifted from "I did nothing wrong" to "maybe what I did wasn't technically legal, but everyone does it." Then there was his response to the January 6th investigations. Trump claimed executive privilege protected him from testifying, even though he was no longer president. He sued to block the National Archives from providing documents to the House committee. He encouraged witnesses to defy subpoenas. When criminal charges came, he argued presidential immunity protected everything he did in office, no matter how illegal. The strategy was always the same: delay, appeal, claim the whole process is illegitimate, and hope something breaks your way before you face real consequences. And let's not forget how Trump handled the E. Jean Carroll defamation cases. After being found liable and ordered to pay millions, Trump went right back on social media and defamed Carroll again, triggering another lawsuit and another massive judgment. When the court ordered him to post bond pending appeal, he fought that too, claiming it was excessive, politically motivated, and unfair. The pattern was identical: commit the act, deny everything, attack the victim in the process, lose in court, claim persecution, refuse to pay, and force every possible procedural fight. Even in his business dealings before politics, Trump was notorious for this exact behavior. Contractors who worked on his properties would finish the job, submit their invoices, and then get lowball settlement offers or outright refusals to pay. When they sued, Trump's army of lawyers would drag cases out for years, burying smaller companies in legal fees until they settled for pennies on the dollar or gave up entirely. The strategy was always to make fighting him more expensive than just accepting the loss. Now that Trump is dealing with government prosecutors and attorneys general with unlimited resources, that strategy doesn't work anymore, and he's discovering what it's like when the other side can't be bullied into submission. So what specifically did the judge say that makes this ruling so devastating? Let's break down the key sections that have legal experts stunned. According to reporters who reviewed the full opinion, the judge's demolition of Trump's claims came in three main sections. First, she addressed the irreparable harm argument. Trump's lawyers claimed that forcing asset sales before the appeal was decided would cause damage that couldn't be undone if Trump eventually won his appeal. The judge noted that New York's bond requirement exists specifically to balance these interests. If Trump believed his appeal had merit, he could protect his assets by posting bond. His failure to do so wasn't evidence that the requirement was unfair, but rather evidence that financial institutions that assess risk for a living didn't believe Trump's assets were worth what he claimed, or that his appeal was likely to succeed. Now, here's the kicker. The judge pointed out the profound irony in Trump's position. He was found liable for fraud because he systematically overvalued his assets to banks and insurers. Now, he was claiming those same assets were so valuable that being forced to post them as bond would cause irreparable harm. But when he tried to actually use those assets to secure a bond, no one would accept them at his claimed valuations. The judge essentially said Trump's inability to secure a bond was the market's verdict on his fraud. If his properties were really worth what he'd always claimed, getting a bond would have been simple. The second major section addressed Trump's due process arguments. His lawyers claimed that enforcing a judgment before the appeals process was complete violated his constitutional rights. The judge destroyed this argument by pointing out that New York's bond requirement is specifically designed to protect due process. Trump can appeal to his heart's content. The bond requirement simply ensures that if he loses the appeal, there are actually assets available to satisfy the judgment. Without it, defendants could strip assets during the appeals process and leave judgment creditors with nothing. The judge noted that this procedure has been upheld repeatedly and that Trump was receiving exactly the process that due process requires, nothing more, nothing less. The third section tackled the political motivation claims. This is where the judge's language became especially pointed. According to legal analysts who reviewed the opinion, she wrote that Trump's pattern of claiming political persecution whenever he faces legal accountability had become tiresome and beneath the dignity of any court proceeding. She noted that Attorney General James brought her case based on evidence that Trump had a full trial with representation, that he cross-examined witnesses and presented his own evidence, and that the court's findings were based on that evidence, not politics. The judge wrote that suggesting otherwise wasn't just wrong, it was an attempt to undermine public confidence in the judicial system itself, and that courts have both the right and responsibility to reject such arguments forcefully. This leaves Trump's legal team in an extraordinarily difficult position. On one side, they need to continue the appeal of the underlying fraud judgment, but that appeal is now proceeding while Trump's assets are being seized to satisfy that judgment. Every day that passes without a successful bond or stay is another day where properties are being evaluated, liens are being filed, and the infrastructure for potential sales is being established. On the flip side, they could try to find some way to secure the bond, but that would require either convincing a financial institution to accept Trump's assets as collateral, which the market has already rejected, or coming up with nearly $500 million in liquid assets, which Trump clearly doesn't have, despite decades of claiming to be a billionaire. The tricky part is that every legal avenue has been tried and rejected. Trump's team has already gone to appellate courts seeking emergency relief. They've been turned down. They've filed for stays. They've been denied. They've argued constitutional violations. The courts aren't buying it. At some point, you run out of legal arguments and you're left with the simple reality that a court found you liable, you owe a massive amount, and if you can't or won't pay, your assets get seized. That's not persecution. That's literally how civil judgments work. Legal analysts are noting that this ruling and the asset seizure process represent a watershed moment in Trump's legal troubles. Andrew Weissmann, former FBI general counsel and a veteran of numerous high-profile prosecutions, went on MSNBC and made a statement that really should catch everyone's attention. He said this is the moment when Trump's entire persona as a brilliant businessman and billionaire collides with legal reality. For decades, Trump has claimed to be worth billions, has used those claims to secure loans and deals, and has built his political identity on being a successful businessman. Now, a court has found that much of that was fraudulent, and his inability to secure a bond is the market's way of saying they agree with the court. This isn't just a legal loss, it's the unmasking of Trump's core identity. Ellie Honig, a former federal prosecutor and CNN legal analyst, added that the judge's ruling was significant not just for what it said, but for its tone. He explained that judges typically bend over backwards to appear neutral and give defendants every benefit of the doubt in their written opinions, especially when those defendants are politically prominent. For a judge to use language as pointed as this ruling contained, to specifically call out a defendant's arguments as bad faith and insulting to the court, that indicates a level of frustration and disrespect that's rare in judicial opinions. It suggests the court has concluded that Trump isn't a good faith litigant, but rather someone who views the legal system as just another arena for manipulation and delay. Even Jonathan Turley, the George Washington University law professor who has frequently defended Trump's legal positions and appeared as a witness for Republicans in Trump's first impeachment, acknowledged that this ruling was legally sound. He told Fox News that while he understood Trump's political arguments about the case being motivated by bias, the legal arguments his team was making about bond requirements and asset seizures simply didn't hold water. Turley noted that New York's procedures are well established, have been upheld many times, and are applied to all defendants regardless of politics. Trump was seeking special treatment, not equal treatment, and courts were right to reject that. So let's break down what this could mean, because it's not just a captivating legal story. It has serious consequences for Trump's business empire, his political future, and the broader question of accountability. First up is the immediate financial impact. If the asset seizure process continues, Trump could lose some of his most valuable and iconic properties. 40 Wall Street, 7 Springs, potentially even portions of Trump Tower could be seized and sold to satisfy the judgment. These aren't just financial assets. They're core components of Trump's brand and identity. Losing them doesn't just cost money. It destroys the image Trump has spent 50 years building. Beyond the immediate properties, there's the cascade effect on Trump's other business interests. According to financial analysts who spoke to Bloomberg, many of Trump's properties operate on significant debt. If his marquee properties start being seized, lenders on other properties may trigger default provisions and accelerate debt repayment. Trump could face a cascade of financial crises across his entire portfolio. What starts as losing a few buildings to satisfy one judgment could spiral into a complete collapse of the Trump organization as various lenders and creditors move to protect their interests. Now, let's touch on what this means for Trump's political situation. Trump has built his entire political identity on being a successful businessman, someone who knows how to make deals and create wealth. Watching his properties get seized to satisfy a fraud judgment directly contradicts that narrative. It's one thing to claim the legal system is rigged against you. It's another thing entirely to have your assets seized because you couldn't secure a bond because financial institutions didn't believe your assets were worth what you claimed. That's not political persecution. That's the market calling you a fraud. Republican primary opponents in Democratic campaigns will absolutely use this. The image of federal marshals showing up at Trump Tower with court orders to seize assets is politically devastating. It confirms every criticism about Trump's business acumen being more smoke and mirrors than substance. Voters who supported Trump because they believed he was a brilliant businessman may start questioning that assumption when they see his empire being dismantled by the very fraud he claimed was impossible. Looking ahead to the general election dynamics, this creates a concrete visual that's difficult for Trump to spin. His usual playbook is to claim persecution, rally his base against the system, and fundraise off his legal troubles. But watching your properties actually get seized takes that narrative into uncomfortable territory. His base may remain loyal, but persuadable voters in swing states may look at asset seizures and conclude that where there's this much smoke, there's probably fire. The institutional implications are equally significant. This case establishes that even former presidents with massive public platforms and political movements behind them are subject to the same legal processes as everyone else. If you commit fraud, you get held accountable. If you lose in court, you pay the judgment. If you can't or won't post bond, your assets get seized. There's no special carve-out for political prominence or claims of persecution. That's a crucial principle for the rule of law. According to legal scholars who spoke to the New York Times, this case will likely become a landmark example of how the justice system handles powerful defendants who try to weaponize procedure and politics to avoid accountability. The judge's willingness to use pointed language in rejecting Trump's bad faith arguments may embolden other judges to be similarly direct when confronting abusive litigation tactics. That could have long-term positive effects on the system's ability to handle defendants who treat courts as political theaters rather than as places where law gets applied. This whole scenario is causing absolute chaos throughout MAGA world and creating deep divisions about how to respond. According to monitoring by multiple news outlets, the reaction from Trump's supporters has split into distinct camps, and those camps are increasingly at war with each other. One faction, represented by voices like Steve Bannon and some of the more aggressive MAGA influencers, is calling this a declaration of war by the deep state. They're arguing Trump should refuse to cooperate, should dare authorities to physically remove him from his properties, and should treat this as the moment for maximum confrontation. On his War Room podcast, Bannon called for Trump supporters to surround Trump Tower and physically block any seizure attempts. Meanwhile, another faction of MAGA world is quietly starting to acknowledge that Trump's legal problems are real and self-inflicted. According to reporting from The Bulwark and other outlets, some Republican strategists and even former Trump administration officials are privately expressing concern that Trump's inability to secure a bond reveals serious problems with his actual financial situation. They're worried that the image of Trump as a successful businessman is being destroyed in real time, and that this damages not just Trump, but the entire Republican brand that hitched itself to him. Then there's a third group that's trying to have it both ways, claiming the judgment is unfair and politically motivated while also suggesting Trump should have settled the case years ago or found a way to post bond. These voices, including some Fox News commentators, are trying to criticize the process while distancing themselves from Trump's specific decisions. But that middle position is increasingly untenable as the asset seizures become reality. Things became even more intense when Trump himself started posting on Truth Social in all caps, calling the judge corrupt, the attorney general a political hack, and suggesting that what's happening to him is what Democrats want to do to all successful conservatives. He's trying to turn his personal, legal, and financial catastrophe into a broader political narrative about persecution. But the problem is that the facts of the case keep getting in the way. It's hard to claim you're being persecuted when the evidence showed you systematically committed fraud for decades, and the only reason your assets